Hello there. So great to be speaking with you again today. I do love our talks. And it's weird because although I don't know you personally, or maybe I do, my podcast audience has this kind of special place in my heart. Like throughout the week, I'm often thinking about you and trying to channel into what you need to hear or what would be helpful to hear. So if you ever have something that you'd like me to talk about, DM me on Instagram at Sammy B Coaching, and I'd love to do an episode on it. I'm here kind of as a resource, and it feels really good to be that. So here I am. Let me know how I can be of service. So today's topic is called Thieves of Joy. You might be familiar with the saying that comparison is the thief of joy. And if you've ever experienced jealousy or envy, you will understand how joy-sucking comparison can be. And I want to talk about comparison, but I also want to talk about the other thief of joy, and that's judgment. And the reason I want to talk about these thieves of joy on a binge eating podcast is because comparison and judgment are actions that do not serve our lives. And so many of binge eating recovery, and so much of binge eating recovery is about healing our relationships with ourselves. Acting in ways that aren't in alignment with our truest selves is often a rooted source of our binge eating behavior. Acting in ways that we don't genuinely want to act is one majorly disruptive way we damage our relationship with ourselves. Now, remember, a healed relationship with yourself isn't a destination. It's not a state of being that we reach. It's continuous, it's flowing. And the more we learn about ourselves, the more we uncover some of the pain, some of the discomfort, some of the disconnect that exists. And healing our relationship with ourselves doesn't mean getting to a place where we'll be happy all the time. It's more of being able to access our truest self, our inner core, our soul, whatever you want to call it, so that we can show up both internally and externally in the world in a way that's true, while loving ourselves when we don't show up authentically, loving ourselves when we fall short of what is true for us. Typically, we often harbor these disconnecting feelings and actions and first don't realize that we have them, so we stay in the dark and kind of block self-awareness. And then, after so much self-denial and shielding, we binge eat. Often when we binge eat, we don't even know why we're doing it. We just think, oh, I must just really like food. But binge eating is a way to soothe and comfort ourselves. When we don't look under the hood, when we don't lift the veil of confusion and begin to understand ourselves more, we don't know what's truly there. That self-disconnect is what drives binge eating for so many of us. So the intent of this episode is to understand if comparison or judgment show up in your life. And instead of shaming yourself for that or denying and avoiding this topic, how do we compassionately look inwards toward healing? How can we be honest and tender with ourselves? I will say this until I am blue in the face, but being compassionate with ourselves isn't condoning our behaviors. Being compassionate is a way to give us strength that we need to lean into accountability. Being compassionate with ourselves is the fuel in our tank to keep us expanding, to keep us evolving back into our truest selves. Side note, if you're confused about how we can evolve back into our truest selves and what that means, I'll do an episode on this, or maybe I have already. But basically, to sum it up, I believe that our truest version of us already exists within us. It's with us when we're born, but we fall out of that trueness, out of alignment when we pick up toxic messages in our lives that tell us we're unworthy or less valuable in certain areas of our lives. I believe growing and evolving isn't becoming a quote unquote better version of us, but a truer version of us that already exists. And life is about shedding the layers of lies and reconnecting and realigning with our inner child, that soul version of us, I like to call it. Okay, back to the program. Let's start with comparison. Comparing ourselves, our lives, our past, our achievements, our successes, our life experiences, our appearances, our finances, our homes, our relationships. Comparing to others is such a disservice to ourselves. Comparison is rooted in scarcity. Comparing ourselves to others isn't a way to encourage ourselves. It's not a way to see what's possible and believe it can be possible for us too. That's not comparison. That's motivation. That's more of a spark. It creates enthusiasm. It ignites a fire in you that feels energetic and eager. That mindset feels abundant, feels like there's so much out there for others and for us. You'll know the difference between comparison and motivation if you're seeing others' success and a fire in you gets sparked to take action that fuels you. That's a spark. If you're seeing others' success and you are motivated to take action that drains you, because if you don't take the action, you'll be left behind, or there will be less available to you, or if you don't take the action, you're not as good or as valuable as a person, that's comparison. Comparison drains you. Comparison depletes your fuel tank by telling you you should be doing this, saying that, wearing this, accomplishing that, in order to be as good as someone else, in order to keep up, in order to deserve the life and relationships you want, or even to deserve the life and relationships you have right now. We often think we're not good enough for what we currently have, like we fooled others into loving us and now we have to keep proving ourselves to them. If you've listened to me for more than a minute, you know how strongly I feel about self-compassion, and you know that compassion fuels us to evolve and expand, and comparison is void of compassion. It's harsh, it's critical, and holds compassion hostage from us, letting us believe compassion is only available when we have what the other person we're comparing ourselves to, has, when we look like she looks, when we do what she does. So we don't evolve and expand like we're meant to. We stay stagnant, swirling around, wondering how hard we can push ourselves and why we just can't keep pushing and white knuckling through the exhaustion without any of that fuel and spark that's required for that long-lasting change. Comparison just keeps us trapped in believing we're unworthy, undeserving, we're unfit or unable to grow. It keeps us disconnected from ourselves. It keeps us stuck in resentment and self-pity and even self-hatred. We typically don't compare ourselves consciously or intentionally. None of us want to compare ourselves with others unless, we think we're better and are looking for that affirmation. But generally, intellectually, we want to be happy for people when they succeed. We want to believe we're also capable of success. In our upper brain, our sophisticated brain, we know this. When we're in our upper brain, we are abundant and know that others' successes don't take away from ours. However, the scarcity comes through when we're in our lower brain, our primal habit brain that adopted lies from our childhood, our early developmental years that told us we aren't enough. And while we might intellectually say we're worthy as we are, our deepest wounding and hidden fears often reveal our own doubts on whether that's true. Maybe we aren't, though. Maybe we aren't as good as this other person. Maybe we aren't enough. So that's why we compare. We only compare about things in life that deep down we fear might be true. For example, if I saw a post of a surgeon who received really high praise for, doing something cutting edge, for being the first to accomplish a certain type of surgery, I wouldn't be jealous or envious. I wouldn't compare myself to this person because no part of me has any desire or any of my identity tied up in being a surgeon. Being in the physical health field has never interested me. My sisters are both in the physical health field, and when they tell me what they do on a daily basis, I'm stunned and amazed and delighted and so impressed. I experience that spark. It motivates me to do big things in my life. The energy that sparks me is so abundant and so full of love. But as a person who struggled with a negative body image my whole life, if I see a thin, toned woman post an image in a swimsuit, I might start to compare. Because deep down, there's a part of me that believes my appearance is somehow tied to my worthiness. Deep down, I believe my inability to maintain a body like that makes me less worthy, less valuable. Deep down, I believe she's better than me in some way, and I should act better to be like her. Now, I still have issues with this deep-rooted belief system. So sometimes comparison is still an automatic response when I see a thin-toned woman in a swimsuit. However, now, instead of shaming myself for it, I compassionately, tenderly comfort myself. I remind myself that that's an old belief pattern. I remind myself that the part of me that's hurting is that little girl from my childhood who heard those messages and believed those painful lies that she wasn't enough as she was. I don't resist or avoid the pain, but I allow it and soothe it with kindness and compassion. And those triggers are happening less and less over time as my relationship with myself continues to grow. Now, is the goal to see a fit woman in a bikini and then be sparked and inspired to take action to be like her? No. I don't think the spark is there to mimic the other person's success or whatever that looks like. Typically, the spark gives you the clean, abundant energy to take action that creates more of what you want or less of what you want. So for me, ideally, when I see a fit woman in a bikini, I will be sparked and inspired to help all women, myself included, feel good in their skin, just like the woman in the bikini. I will see her confidence not as a threat to bigger bodies, but as an inspiration of how women can feel in their skin. Now, of course, we can't feel confident in our bodies 100% of the time, but seeing a woman delight in her body can give all women permission to do the same, and I can take that energy with me if that's what I want more of in my life. Of course, I don't have to do any of that. I get to choose. So now, let's turn to the other thief of joy, judgment. I'm not referring to the type of judgment that's within you that discerns and navigates you in your life. I'm not talking about discernment. I'm talking about criticism, judgment as a way to evaluate others. Now, self-judgment or self-criticism is the antithesis of self-compassion, and we all know how important self-compassion is, right? If not, I will continue to preach it every day for the rest of my life. So one day, if you keep listening to me, you might actually start to believe it. For this conversation, however, I want to focus on judging others, evaluating, criticizing others. Now, we all do this to some degree. It's a natural reaction, and often it happens subconsciously without us really being cognitively aware that it's happening. We typically don't set out to go judge people, but when we do it, it actually causes a lot of suffering in our lives. Notice how I didn't say in their lives. Sure, saying or commenting mean things to people, like to them, can inspire those people to then think negative thoughts about themselves, which would cause suffering. But those people actually get to think their own thoughts. They could just disagree with the mean comments. They get to decide which thoughts they want to think. This doesn't mean I recommend saying mean things to people. I definitely do not. Let's just spread more love in this world. There's enough hate. But I do want to point out that the only power you truly have is with what you think and therefore feel, not what others think and feel. And typically, most often, we silently judge others. So we don't tell them the judgmental thoughts we're thinking. Do you know why? Because we don't want to hurt their feelings. So what do we do instead? We hurt our own feelings. We steal our own joy. When we judge people, we're the ones that actually suffer. Let me explain. Judging, consistently harboring critical thoughts about other people blocks you from connecting with them. As humans, we all crave connection, belonging. We strive to understand people and their point of view. When someone does something we simply don't understand, we typically want to understand it. We want to understand the context, the motivation, which is why, when there's a crime, we as onlookers desire to know the motive. Why did they do it? Even though we don't condone or agree with the action they took, it alleviates some sort of internal discourse when we can know why they did it. Even if it doesn't help, even if we hate the reason, we want to know the reason. So even if this person is not a person you would want to connect with, judging them is still hurtful to you because it fills your brain with painful thoughts that cause painful emotions. They shouldn't do that. They should do that. They shouldn't say that. They should say that. They shouldn't wear that. They should wear that. They shouldn't look like that. They should look like that. Those are judgmental thoughts that we, as the people thinking them, can think over and over. And like I said, we all do it. We all have these manuals for other people on how they should act. Like an instruction manual when you get a new device, we think over and over on repeat that others should follow this manual. And ironically, or maybe not so ironically, this manual is often stemmed from the manual we have created for ourselves to follow. Our manual tells us how we should act, how we should talk, how we should be in the world. Now, we might have had a hand in creating our manual, maybe from our parents, our friends, our religion, our social or cultural groups. But we each have a manual of how we think we should act and how others should act. And typically, the stricter our manual is for ourselves, the stricter our manual is for others. I'm going to say that again. The stricter our manual is for ourselves, so the more rules we have about how we should live our lives, the stricter our manual is for others, meaning the more rules we have for others about how they should live their lives. When we have a bunch of strict rules for our own lives, that can be very taxing. It's draining. It's a lot for us to manage and bear, especially when we don't really agree with them in a genuine, authentic sense. And then we get really frustrated when others don't seem to worry about our rules, because we spend a lot of our lives managing our rules. How dare they so easily break them or not even care about them? Well, typically the reason is because they don't have those same rules. Maybe they were told different messages of what's important. Maybe they came to different conclusions based on their own life experiences. Either way, each person has a different manual for themselves, and each person thinks their manual is the best manual. Even if they can't follow it perfectly, which they usually make mean that they're flawed or weak or there's something wrong with them. The manual isn't the problem. Most people really like their manual, or at least if they haven't really evaluated it, they believe it to just be universal truth and everyone should follow it. So you can imagine the resentment that builds when others don't follow the manual we have for them. Many religions have manuals, and depending on our personal experiences with that religion, we might believe it to be 100% accurate, or, who knows, maybe 50% accurate. And we might not like calling it a manual. That might sound too clerical. Maybe a roadmap for joy, or like a way of living that makes you the happiest. I don't know. None of these descriptions sound very spiritual, but hopefully you get the idea. When we have these strict, concrete manuals, we can very easily slip into judgment when others aren't following them. Often in religion, this is where self-righteousness can come into play. But it's not just in religion. Self-righteousness can show up in many other secular belief systems as well. So why is this strict manual for ourselves, which we often place onto other people, stealing our joy? Not only does it disconnect us from one another, but it creates a whole system of thought that is very rigid. It shrinks our window of tolerance, making us more emotionally volatile. Let's define window of tolerance. So our window of tolerance is a term used to describe the zone of arousal or emotion in which a person is able to function most effectively. So when people are within this zone, when they're in their window of tolerance, they are able to readily receive, process, and integrate information and respond to the demands of everyday life without much difficulty. The window of tolerance was first named as such by Dan Siegel, who we love, who I've mentioned before on the podcast. He's a psychiatrist and writer who specializes in interpersonal neurobiology. So when a person is within their window of tolerance, their brain is functioning well and they can effectively process stimuli. That person is likely to be able to reflect, to think rationally, and make decisions calmly without feeling either overwhelmed or withdrawn. When people go outside of their window of tolerance, usually during times of extreme stress, people will experience periods of either hyper or hypoarousal. You don't really need to know all this, but here it is anyway. If it interests you, it interests me. So hyperarousal, otherwise known as the fight and flight response, is characterized by, hypervigilance, feelings of anxiety or panic and racing thoughts. Hypoarousal, or the freeze response, can cause feelings of emotional numbness, emptiness, paralysis. In either of these states, we become unable to process stimuli effectively. Our prefrontal cortex region of our brain, our upper brain, shuts down, affecting the ability to think rationally, causing our feelings to become dysregulated, which may take the form of chaotic responses or overly rigid responses. For bingers, this is most often when we binge, when we're outside the window of tolerance. So having these strict manuals for ourselves and others can shrink our window of tolerance by adding stress that can cause us to over or underreact, that causes us to be emotionally dysregulated. People who frequently operate outside of their window of tolerance may experience issues like depression and anxiety. I'm not suggesting that you have to condone or agree with all of the different value systems in the world in order to be emotionally regulated. I'm not saying you have to like other people's choices. You get to choose your manual. My only suggestion is that you actively choose it, that you don't just copy and paste it without understanding and evaluating it, and that you like your reasons for your manual's rules or values, that you're not operating your own manual from a place of trying to earn your own personal worth or value because you don't think you're good enough without keeping the rules of your manual. You can keep your values and rules that feel good to you, that feel in alignment. And to plug self-compassion again, allowing compassion as an integral part of your manual will inherently make it less rigid, therefore widening your window of tolerance. Like I said, you don't have to condone or even like other people's manuals, but the more you argue with them, the more you concern yourself with other people's manuals, the more importance you place on people following your manual for them, the more joy is stolen from your life. Because darn if we don't try. But we can't control people's actions. We can ask them to change their behaviors, to change their thoughts even. We can set up boundaries or consequences by defining our response when they behave in a certain way. But ultimately, we cannot control people. And the more we think we can, the more we obsess and ruminate about the incorrect actions they're taking, whatever that means, the more miserable we become. So much of our joy is stolen when we make our contentment contingent on other people's actions. And when we fight the reality of what has already happened, when we obsess over what someone did or how we wish they wouldn't have done that, we rob ourselves of joy, of peace, of contentment. Fighting and resisting reality creates so much suffering in our lives versus letting the pain of the reality just be there and taking actions to serve your future by setting boundaries if this happens again, by calling for change to legislation that hurts people. That's purposeful action. But stewing and fighting that it actually happened, or thinking you can change people's actions just by trying harder to control them, is what steals our joy. We get to keep our belief systems if we like them. We get to keep our manuals for ourselves. We get to like the actions we take and the reasons why we take them. That is a beautiful thing. So how do we let others do the same? How do we let others keep their manual, even if it's different from ours? How do we let other people write their own manual? The answer is tricky in its simplicity. We just let them. Maybe they know what's best for them. Maybe this is exactly what they need right now. Maybe they won't know until they carry out the actions. Maybe their journey is different than ours. As long as they're not actively hurting others or objectively creating unsafe environments for other people, maybe we can let them write their own manual. Maybe letting go of strict rules for others will be an act of true love, true liberation, not for them, because remember, they actually get to do what they want. Our rules don't actually matter to them. But maybe letting go of our strict rules for others will be an act of liberation for ourselves. Maybe laying down our manuals, kind of like laying down a weapon, will be the act of self-love that will unlock some healing in our lives. Maybe it will offer so much needed peace, the peace we are searching for by having them follow our rules in the first place. So many of us struggle with comparison and judgment and believe we're powerless against them, like we don't have a say. We're just so insecure or so judgmental that we can't help ourselves. But I want to remind us that we weren't born with these qualities. Our insecurities, our critical natures, our learned behaviors. We learned them, likely in an effort to keep us safe at some point. But either way, no matter how we learned them, we don't have to keep them if they're not serving us. And I invite you to look inward and discern if these belief systems are in fact serving you. What would it look like to let them go? Who would you be without them? Maybe this is some of the work you have to address to heal your relationship with your truest self. As always, I'm here if you want to talk one-on-one, anytime. Schedule a free 30-minute call with me to see if my 12-week End Secret Binging program is right for you. And it might not be right for you, but that first step might be just what you need to get one step closer to a healed relationship with yourself. Visit sammybcoaching.com, that's SAMMYBEE coaching.com to schedule a free call. And make sure to follow me on Instagram for more content at sammybcoaching. Oh, and if you're liking the podcast, first of all, yay. And second, could you rate and review it? Because that would just be so lovely. Thank you, friends. I'll see you next week.